Well, hello, and thank you for attending this talk. My name is Patrick Rutty. I'm a technical director at Enverus. I'm based in Edinburgh, Scotland, and I want to talk today about a multivariate analytics study that I did in an area up in the Williston Basin. This is the study area shown in a map on the right. We'll talk about the different colors on the map in a little bit, but basically 1,300 horizontal middle Bakken wells were the study wells. Montreal County provides a really nice data set for analytical modeling because of the diversity of data, the variety of data. You can see from the 4 histograms that are shown here on the left hand of the slide. Completion dates ranging from 2006 to 2018. Lateral lengths, some of them kind of silly low, but basically ranging from 2,000 feet up through about 10, 12,000 feet. Spikes predictably at 1 mile and 2 mile lateral length. Bottom left, you can see spacing. We'll talk about how I measured spacing out here, but basically spacing, a wide variety of spacing out here. This is nearest neighbor spacing, roughly, from next door to 3,000 feet. And proppant per foot. Again, these are just examples. A lot of jobs pumped up here with 500 pounds per foot of proppant. Some up to 1,000 and even 2,000, and not much beyond that. The scale on that's a little bit out of control, but the point is wide ranges of data, and lots of wells, which makes for it's a really great opportunity to do some analytical modeling. So the method that we used here, we'll show you some images of it here in just a bit, but basically we're going to use a number of input variables and to try to predict cumulative 5-year production, BOE, 5-year BOE. We're going to use principal components analysis and the alternating conditional expectation algorithm to do both linear and nonlinear multivariate analysis. And we'll talk again more about the models, but that's the method that we used here. I'm going to start by telling you what I found. Conclusions that I would draw from this work are, number one, any well spacing metric that doesn't include that's not date dependent and doesn't include depletion is not going to work that well. You have to include those two things to have a really robust measurement of spacing. In this study, parent wells had the lowest 5-year production, probably because they had the kind of weakest completions. The sort of next generation of wells, again, we'll talk about these well classes in just a moment, had the best production. And the latest stage wells, the more impacted child wells is what I'm calling them, they're better than the parents, but not as good as the ones right before them. They drilled into a very depleted reservoir. The predictive production modeling that I did here is easier for the early stage wells when the reservoir is not such a mess, and it's difficult for the more impacted, the later stage child wells. But in all the models, water cut and lateral length are really, really strong variables, really impactful variables. These multivariate nonlinear models that we build don't have parametric equations. The variables don't have weights because their weights change based on what the other variables are doing. But throughout the modeling up here, water cut and lateral length are very important variables. As you move into a focus in the modeling on slick water and hybrid completions, proppant load and depth become increasingly important. And for slick water jobs, at the end of the day, because the question that I asked myself here was, hey, what are the independent impacts of proppant and fluid on parents and children? At the end of the day, when you increase proppant in slick water jobs, it has more impact, a more positive impact than adding fluid, especially in areas with thicker middle Bakken reservoir. And I'll show you how I came to those conclusions. But the intent here was to study this area, keeping in mind that the locations we have left to drill in between all these sticks on the map that have been drilled are almost all going to be what you would call late stage development, more impacted child wells. They're going to be close to other wells that have been there for a while. So I want to know, how do I drill those wells the best? So what's my parent-child methodology? I defined parent wells as those wells that within 3,000 feet did not have any other wells that either pre-existed them or came within 180 days of the subject well. Those are parent wells. Every other well then, and again, I was only doing middle Bakken wells, every other well is a child well. And then so for each one of the child wells, I calculated the average distance to the nearest neighbor, again with the same time constraints, how long the nearest neighbor had been producing. Sometimes if the nearest neighbor came within 6 months after completion of the subject well, it actually kind of had a negative number of days of producing. You'll see how I normalize for that later. And I evaluated the coverage of the well, which you could think of as boundedness. And if I can get my fingers in the right place on the recording here, if this is my subject well and this is my nearest neighbor, it's not very bounded, but that is highly bounded. And I think most of us are using that sort of terminology these days. So, distance, days, and coverage are the three things that go into what I'm going to call a spacing factor, and I combine them this way to accentuate, all the good things. And so I took my number of days, I shifted them by 181 days to account for the timing that I just talked about, multiplied them by coverage squared, that's my boundedness, and divided by distance. So a big number here means bad things, and a low number, in fact a negative number, means good things. Well, I took the log of it, and that's why I ended up with some negative numbers. At the end of the day, the smaller the spacing factor, the less impact you've had on you as a well. And the higher the spacing factor, the more impacted you've been. And now I'm starting to use this language of impacted. Here's a histogram of my child wells, going from about -4, almost -5 on the left, over to 1 on the right-hand side. The colors represent the completion date, with the hotter colors being more recent completion dates. And you can see most of the more impacted wells have been completed recently. They're in crowded neighborhoods with with wells that have pre-existed them for a long time and have depleted the reservoir. The red line represents approximately a median value for the data set. And then the less impacted child wells are over on the left. You can see they tend to be older wells. When they were drilled, they were less impacted. The way I handled the parents was I assigned them an arbitrary spacing factor of -5.5, so they would fit on the spectrum, and you'll see how I use that. So what I did was I took have a lot of data about all these wells. I'm going to try to predict cum 5-year BOE, that's what I've got in the red square there, using these variables. I'm skipping a lot of steps in the process of analytical model building, where you try lots of things and they don't work, or they sort of work, or you think they work and then you have to QC them and it turns out you're not comfortable with them. We'll talk a bit about that. What I ended up with were 8 predictor variables. Water cut, I used 4 to 12 month water cut to try to take out some of the flowback fluid. I used median well log values for both deep resistivity and neutron porosity. I took the average depth of the lateral portion of the wellbore. I used cumulative GOR, proppant per foot, footage, that's lateral length, so lateral length, and it's actually lateral length in zone. And then I used fluid per foot. And I used those 8 variables to see how well they could predict the cum 5-year BOE for these what ended up being 1,280 wells. And that's the result on the right-hand side. That cross plot is on the y-axis predicted. So this is the prediction, the model, using those 8 inputs and understanding all the relationships, comes up with a prediction that's over here. And on the x-axis, we have the actual 5-year. And you can see, obviously, a perfect prediction would be a straight line, that red line. It's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good. It's a 0.752 R squared, which is a pretty good, that's a very predictable model. One of the ways that I've helped that correlation be as high as it is, although it's high if you don't do this, I've broken the data set into three classes: the parents, the more impacted and less impacted children, and I've modeled them all together. And you can see them all highlighted there. Well, great. How do you know what the algorithms, principal components analysis and the alternating conditional expectation, how do you know what those 2 algorithms have done with the data? What if the algorithms built relationships that don't make physical sense? That would be bad. That's the sort of thing that we like to guard against. And so here's some QC plots. These are transformation plots that actually are sort of derivative products from the way that the alternating conditional expectation algorithm works. But here's how you use these. Look at water cut. And these are for the parent-child classes, which are labeled over there on the right. As water cut increases from left to right, increasing water cut drives these values increasingly lower. In fact, it drives these values into negative territory. This is a relative measurement over here on the y-axis of how this variable impacts production, which is what I'm trying to predict. Low water cuts impact production positively. Not a shock, right? High water cuts impact production negatively. Well, that's exactly what you'd expect, which is good news. You don't want the math in the algorithm to build a relationship that doesn't make physical sense. This one makes physical sense. Good news. Lateral length. As lateral length increases, so does production. It gets better and better and better. Here you can actually see that for the more impacted children, the ones in brownish yellow tan, lateral length actually had a kind of has a bigger range of values over here than it does for the other classes. So it had a bigger impact in the more impacted children than it did in the other two classes. Kind of an interesting thing. Again, water cut, you can see very, very big range for all the classes. So you can go on through the other variables. These are actually in rank order of importance. Proppant per foot, as it increases, 5-year cum increases. Resistivity. Now this one, we're getting to the point now where it doesn't have a ton of impact, but as resistivity increases, 5-year cum does increase slightly. Same for depth, same for porosity, same for fluid per foot, and same for GOR. Some of these relationships start to be a little interesting. Depth has a different relationship for parents than it does for children wells. GOR for more impacted children actually negatively impacts production. We could get into a whole discussion of what happens in a depleted reservoir and why GOR might have that impact. That's probably an interesting discussion to have. The point here that I want to make, though, is this is a QC for first principles. Yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm going to go back to the GOR thing right now while we're here. Higher GOR wells in more impacted children means you're almost for sure means you're drilling into depleted reservoirs, and you're going to suffer from that depletion more. That's probably what it's telling us. Let's look at the models individually quickly. Parent wells, very high correlation. R squared over 0.8. Summary of the parent, less impacted and more impacted children over here with each of the input variables. And over here, the dominant variables in rank order. Less impacted children, slight shuffle in the ranking of the variables, very good R squared, best one, 0.823. And then for the more impacted children, again, a shuffle in the importance of the variables, the rank order, and R squared now down below 0.7. It's a 0.658. So, and look at that. That's kind of predictable. What I'd really like to do is get better at predicting these guys, because this type of well, the more impacted child well, the well that's close to wells that have pre-existed it for a long time, and bound it very tightly, closely, or it's highly bounded. Those are the sorts of locations that we have left to drill out here. So I'd like to understand these wells. I'd like to model them really well so that I can then make predictions using my model. You'll see what I mean. So now let's move to multivariate model 2. I'm just going to model my more impacted children. I now have only 450 wells in my model data set because I've added a factor here. I have a different classification. Let me just put this stuff on the slide. I've added a variable to my data set over here, which is my well spacing factor. That's not why my data set got smaller. The R squared of this model is great. It's much better than my 0.65 from before. It's up about 130, 140 points. But what I've done here is I've modeled independently slickwater, hybrid, linear, and crosslink treatment types. And that's what's added to the improvement here. Sorry, there was supposed to be a label there for those different treatment types, but we'll see it in a little bit here. Here are the colors. If we look at those transformation plots on just the model for the more impacted more impacted children, you can see for proppant, slickwater jobs, here I'm going to focus on slickwater jobs because that's what people are pumping these days. If you're pumping a slickwater job on a more impacted child location, on a well, proppant has a pretty big impact. It can have a big negative impact if you don't pump enough of it, and it can have a pretty big positive impact if you do pump up to 1,000, 1,400, maybe even more pounds per foot. Very big impact on the slickwater jobs. Fluid per foot, on the other hand, has not much impact on any of the rheology types, any of the completion types. And for slickwater, it actually models out as having more fluid is a slightly negative impact. That doesn't make a lot of physical sense to me, but it also doesn't have a huge impact. What the model is telling me is that for all cases, proppant matters more than fluid, and I think that's the important takeaway here. Obviously, there are physical limitations to how much proppant you can put in a slick water job given the same amount of fluid, but I think you get the point. Okay, so I've built a model. That model, again, multivariate, nonlinear, because a lot of these relationships are nonlinear. So many of these relationships, I mean, you can see from the transformation plots, they're nonlinear. I've related each of those 8, now 9 predictor variables to my response variable, the output that I'm trying to figure out, my 5-year Q. And what can I do with it? Well, I could tell the model that instead of everything varying the way it did in real life, maybe you could just say, hey, look, every well is a slick water job. Since you know so much, Mr. Model, about what slick water jobs do, let's make every well be a slick water job. So I just did that over here on the left. I just input the class number for slick water jobs. Let's make every well have 40 barrels a foot of fluid, 500 barrels a foot of proppant, pounds per foot of proppant, and be 9,500 foot lateral length. And that's exactly what I'm doing as I'm typing into the model over there. I'm fixing those variables that, let's say, it's fair to fix. It's not fair of me to fix porosity or GOR or depth, because those are what they are. When I go drill the wells, wherever they're going to be in the future, I don't get to change those things, but I do get to change my lateral length, my treatment type, my fluid, and my proppant. Some other things too that we didn't model, but those are the things I can control. So that's what I mean by fixing the variables and doing model realizations. Then what I can do, we've just talked about this. I'll let those variables vary as they do in nature. I'll fix lateral length at 9,500. And then I'll see what would the results have been if I pumped fluid and proppant in various different combinations. The first one, as you might predict, is going to be 40 barrels a foot of fluid, 500 pounds per foot of proppant. There's your output. There's your 5-year Q over there. Reds and yellows are more, up to 275, 300,000 barrels. And the cooler colors, the purples on the map are going to be 100,000. You can see the histogram color bar up there. Okay. Now I'm looking at the same model, but with 1,000 pounds per foot of proppant, and you can see an increase in the hot colors. So, in fact, if you just look at the histograms, you can see how I went too fast there, but the EURs have been pushed to the right. You're getting better wells. Now we're going to do the same thing with 80 barrels of fluid. Here's 80 barrels and 500 pounds per foot of proppant. We're going to now look at 80 barrels and 1,000 pounds per foot of proppant, and again, you'll see the hot colors increase. And then we'll look at some difference maps. So, yep, here you see it. You're getting better results as you move to 1,000 pounds per foot of proppant. So regardless of how much fluid you're pumping, more proppant's better. And I realize that's not an earth-shattering revelation, but this analytical model will tell you how much better it is, not just that it is better. So now that I've missed all of these cues, let's look at the difference between 1,000 pounds and 500 pounds per foot of proppant and 80 barrels of fluid. And it's between 20 and 40,000 barrels per well. On a per well basis, that's the improvement that you're seeing. Well, let's pump 1,500 pounds per foot with that 80 barrels per foot of fluid. And then, so that's the result of that over here on the left. And then let's look at the difference between the 1,000 barrels and the 1,500 barrels. Again, I'm just looking at how much improvement I got in production by adding more proppant. That map is going to come up here in just a second. Here's that. Now you're picking up not just 20 to 40,000 barrels, but in some places, you're really getting a big improvement. You're getting 80 to 100 to 150,000 barrels. And now finally we look at the difference at 80 barrels per foot of fluid between pumping 500 pounds and 1,500 pounds per foot of proppant. And I'm flicking back and forth between the production map and the thickness map for the Bakken. And here you can see the Nesson anticline. On the east side of the Nesson anticline is this thick that I'm highlighting. And in that thick, is where it seems like you pick up the most improvement in production. So I'll just say it briefly. In slick water jobs, pumping more proppant helps more in thicker middle Bakken. Spend your money there. That's the point. Don't spend your money pumping more proppant in thin middle Bakken because it's not going to help you much. So I don't have time to really to go through each one of the conclusions one by one. Here they are repeated though, basically the same slide as at the beginning. Bottom line, we've already emphasized the point a whole bunch. Number 8 down there. As far as acknowledgements, I'd like to thank my company, Enverus, for allowing me to do this really fun and interesting work. Bill Bayshore, one of my mentors at the company, Riteja and Akash, my colleagues at the company, Lean Wires, who kicked off some of the original, posed the idea for the original work last year, and Urtec for allowing me to present. Thank you.